is the tipping point for companies to shift manufacturing out of China and back to the United States? Gregory Burkart is managing director and leader of the site selection and incentives advisory practice of Duff and Phelps. Greg, welcome.
Thank you, Robert.
So, what about this question? What does your recent research tell you about the tipping point, as you might want to call it, for companies manufacturing in China? What are the factors, and are we there yet?
Well, Robert, our analysis indicates that we're there for certain industries. Back in the late 1990s, the Boston Consulting Group did a series of studies that they rightfully coined as, the tipping points. And at that point in time, most of the analysis focused on cost. They were looking at labor costs and they were looking at logistics costs. And as China started automating more, they changed the equation considerably, retained a lot of the manufacturing activity in China over the last 20 years or so. But things have changed recently with COVID and with some of the other activities that have happened here with the relationship between China and the United States. And so what's happened is our clients, folks who are in the C-suite, they're actually factoring in more risk variables into the equation than just cost. And so as they look at their expanded equation, they start to consider things like innovation, IP protection. There's a lot of CEOs these days whose scorecards are actually based on worker safety, product quality. They're also today, because of the current administration and some of the issues going on in Washington, they're having to consider whether or not their company could be designated as a critical company or be participating in a critical industry. And then finally, the environmental standards have shifted. The regulatory framework has shifted here recently. So when you factor in these additional 4 or 5 variables to the overall equation, today the tipping point looks a lot closer for some of the industries, not all of them, but some of the industries.
Just about all the factors that you just cited are in some way related to the coronavirus pandemic. Is in fact that the case, that it is the pandemic that has caused that tipping point to be approached? Or were there other factors at work before this started that might have led companies in the same direction, if not quite as quickly?
Robert, it really was the pandemic, I think, that raised the risk issue in the corporate supply chains. And once the pandemic took effect, and remember, it took effect in Asia before it happened here in the United States. So companies that had global supply chains, they were impacted starting in December, January, and February, long before the virus ever reached the shores of the US. So I would say that this sort of expanded equation for determining whether or not to reshore some of your operations really started with the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that indeed, in terms of the types of products we're talking about, that it started with so-called emergency supplies, personal protective equipment, ventilators, masks, and things like that? Was that the cutting edge of it, or was it a wider range of products from the very start?
Well, I'd say it's actually a wider range of products than just emergency protective equipment. For example, kind of going along at the same time was the overall China-U.S. Trade disruption. And so there were sensitivities around some of the electronic components, some of the navigational equipment that was being produced offshore. And so I would say, as both the pandemic and then also as these tariffs hit, we started seeing, those industry sectors really being the ones that were the most sensitive and the ones that had to respond first. No doubt, just in terms of the importance, it was the PPE that really raised the issue, I think, for the consumers. But for our corporate clients, it was electronics and some of those components for the overall finished goods that were also being impacted, that was causing disruptions here in the U.S. manufacturing.
Yeah. Well, it certainly seems that there are a lot of problems that could be solved by bringing manufacturing back. You shorten the distance, you shorten the risk, you get more immediate access to essential supplies. But of course, there are other factors involved that make it difficult, are there not? How feasible is it truly for this to happen on a real broad scale, for a bunch of manufacturing to come back here? And what are some of the factors that need to be taken into account in order to make that work?
Well, Robert, that's a good question, and it's to reshore all of these industries at the same time is a Herculean effort, no
Mhm.
doubt. However, if you work in a very methodical and staged approach, I think these industry sectors could come back. For example, I think recently the administration's Trade and Manufacturing Policy Office has been focusing on, for example, drug intermediates. Right, you need to
Mhm.
repatriate the drug intermediate manufacturing before you can actually repatriate, the final pharmaceutical product. So I think if you work in a methodical approach to reshoring, it's doable. But
Yeah.
certainly, if you try to bring it all back all at one time, it would be a Herculean undertaking.
And is it a binary decision? I mean, is it China or the US with no other third possibility? Because we hear about maybe, I don't know, Mexico as being an alternative. It's closer without actually being in this country, supposedly cheaper labor. Or is it just A or B kind of decision that companies are making right now?
Well, that's a very good question, Robert, because um, you know um, the C-suite is actually looking at it not as a binary question about just China or the United States. So, for example, they are looking at nearshore opportunities, whether that would be Mexico or even Canada. With the recently renegotiated USMCA. But
Mhm.
you also, if you're going to, as an executive, if you're going to be looking at Mexico, you also need to consider the risks of Mexico. There certainly is a lot of violence and drug activity that's still occurring in Mexico that's very disruptive for manufacturing and for travel for expats. So when you look at the entire equation as to whether or not you bring it back to the United States or whether you nearshore it, there's a lot of considerations to take into account.
Yeah. And one of the things that caused this thinking to begin was the shutdown of factories in China on a temporary basis because the pandemic, as you say, hit that country first. But then, of course, we have shutdowns here too. We have one of the more cases than anywhere else in the world. So bringing manufacturing back here when factories are closed here, that doesn't seem like a solution at all. So does that not cause these companies to pause in their decision a little bit?
For some, it does, and for others, it doesn't. Because remember, there's a number of factories back here in the United States that actually produce global products. So just take a look at the automotive industry as an example. BMW down in Greenville, Spartanburg produces the X series. So I think it's the 1, 3, 5, and now even the 7 down in Spartanburg. That's a global product. They produce not only for the United States market, but they produce globally. So as the pandemic moved through Asia, and they started resuming consumer activity in China, they were exporting those vehicles back to China. So it really kind of depends on the I think the product and the destined market here in the United States. But certainly, if you're
Yeah.
just producing here in the United States, if your plant is shut down, you're gonna find yourself in a predicament. But I think for global manufacturers here in the United States, they were producing for those markets where the pandemic had actually moved through.
And doesn't it to some extent also involve the need to completely restructure your supplier base, up your multiple tiers of suppliers? A lot of these factories are close to so-called supplier campuses. I mean, if you bring your main factory back to the United States, What do you do about all the suppliers that were supplying that factory? Do you need to bring those back too? That seems like an enormous challenge.
So the question is not only at the OEM level, the original equipment
Right.
manufacturing level, but as you suggest, also the tier ones, tier twos, and tier threes as well. Now,
Hmm.
fortunately, here in the United States, we do have some industries that have created not only an OEM facility, but also have incorporated some of the supplier facilities in there as well. So take a look at, again, going back to the auto industry, take a look at what Toyota has done, down in, say, for example, Huntsville, with the recently announced expansion that they're going to do with Mazda. They're incorporating a supplier park as part of that. So that's your tier ones and tier twos. So it really is a holistic question, not just what do you do at the OEM level, but what do you do with your tier ones and tier twos?
Yeah. Well, then to circle this back to the beginning of our conversation as to whether indeed we have reached a tipping point, I guess you're telling me yes and no. I mean, depending on the industry. I mean, how do you see the future? Do you see this continuation of this trend to the point where more companies will come back?
We do, primarily because companies are actually taking a look at more than just the cost equation.
Hmm.
They're actually considering, when you think about what just happened, what maybe about a year or so ago with the Business Roundtable, where CEOs are starting to consider, the all of their stakeholders, not just shareholders, but all
Hmm.
of the stakeholders.
Questioning the very
And when you
purpose of a corporation, in fact, and as you say, yeah.
Correct.
Hmm.
And so now, when you have that sort of expanded view of who your stakeholders are, all of a sudden now you have to take into consideration more factors, and that's where risk enters the equation. And
Yeah.
so that's why we see, we've identified at least 8 industries that we think for our benchmark would be the ones that would be the most ready to reshore. Things like automobile parts, navigational, electromedical, and control instruments and equipment,
Hmm.
communication equipment, medical equipment and supplies, as you had mentioned, PPE, but also aerospace parts, semiconductor and other electronic components. There's a lot of those industries that we feel are ready for reshoring. Once you consider their importance and the overall risks that are inherent in the supply chain.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, interesting to see what's going to happen, but thank you so much, Gregory Burkart of Duff and Phelps, to give us a snapshot of just how close we are to the so-called tipping point for reshoring. Thanks very much for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Robert, thank you for your time. We appreciate it as well. You take care.
Thank you.